What if you're missing the warning signs of an eating disorder for you, a family member or somebody that you love? In this episode, Lauren Vickery, anorexia survivor and fellow therapist, reveals exactly what to watch out for and what to do to help.
Oh, I don't know whether I want to be with your dad anymore. For a child who's in the middle of that dynamic, to almost feel responsible for the decision of that, that's a heavy responsibility to place on a kid. That is a dangerous territory for an eating disorder to develop. That voice becomes your friend. It's the thing that's always there, and nobody sets out to go and potentially kill themselves. If you'd asked me back then to eat a slice of chocolate cake, that would have been the equivalent to telling me, like, the world was ending now. How are people supposed to stop getting to a point of almost dying? Because the whole function of the eating disorder is...
Just looking at some background of what you do now, you seem to work with both athletes and private clients, and I know you specialise in eating disorders as well. How do you see disorders manifesting differently across those two different groups?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely differences, and there's also a lot of similarities. The differences, obviously, they're in a public setting a lot of the time, because these are, you know, whether they're Premier League footballers or, you know, in cricket or motocross. I've worked across lots of different sports.
How did you get into it?
So I actually got asked if I would be interested, and then it just kind of spiraled from there. It wasn't something I'd set out to do. I hadn't really ever thought about it, and ironically, because my family were connected with football loosely, but I'd always kind of said, like, I don't really want to work like with footballers, and I don't want to work with eating disorders. And I ended up working with both, and I absolutely love it now. But like originally, I was like, those are the two areas that, you know, that wouldn't be my kind of thing I want to do. But actually, I believe that actually it's worked out that way for a reason. And
absolutely.
Probably, I just got to trust in that process a little bit, and that's what I've kind of done with it.
It's funny, when Rich was here last time and we were talking about trusting the process, he said, fucking hate that phrase, trusting the process, but we keep saying it.
I literally say, okay, I'm going to trust the process, but tell me what the process is first, tell me how it's going to play out, what happens at the end of that process, and then I'm going to trust in it. Yeah. Which isn't trusting in the process
no, it's
at
not.
all.
No, it's a blind process. It's a what?
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, I don't trust in the process always myself, but I have to lean into that definitely. Yeah. But in terms, did you ask me about the differences?
So the differences and similarities between, you know, working with athletes and say just your normal client base. What does that look like? How do they differ?
I guess the main difference is, you know, for example, if you're someone in the public, you're not like, you can say, okay, you know, maybe if you want to look, if you're getting stuff on social media, maybe reduce your social media, or maybe like look at, you know, making sure that you protect yourself first before, you know, if you're open to like criticism and things like that. Whereas if you're in the public eye, then you don't have that choice. And I think the difference is as well is that in a lot of the athletes that I've worked with, obviously if you're at a pro athlete level, the control you have in your life is a lot less than, you know, your generic person, you know, whether it comes down to what they're eating and what their diet is, because that's all done by a nutritionist. Like, that's all done for them. They don't have a choice in that, in terms of whether they go out at the weekend and go and get drunk or something. Do you know what I mean? Like, they can't do that because they have to play football. They're an athlete. They're going to be monitored. They're like, everything is checked down to a T. And obviously part of that as well is looking at, you know, their body, and the focus is their body, you know, whereas in, you know, usually in the public setting, people haven't got that focus on their body. They might focus on it themselves. However, they haven't got hundreds of people keeping an eye on every detail of their body, and also being criticised for how their body's performing or what it's doing. Do you know what I mean?
It's next level stress, I should imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it completely, you know, your body is almost...
Doesn't really belong to you, does it?
No.
It belongs to an organisation or a marketing team or a sports therapist or whatever it might be.
And you just think, like, how, if you're trying to, with my work with people with eating disorders in general, it's about looking at like, okay, you know, those positive relationships with their body for one, but two, also understanding that there's a person underneath that.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you come from an athletic background, it's their focus is on their body and how it performs. Do you know what I mean? And less about the person underneath it.
Just as you were saying that, I was thinking how hard it must be to strike a balance between what's good for you and what could be seen as an advantage in a sports setting, but not necessarily as a mental health setting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even some of, for example, you know, in a sports setting, and I know this is changing now, but they do skin fold tests in like the football.
What?
Yeah.
Okay, skin. I'm just going to write that down. Skin fold test.
Skin fold test. I've mainly, it's mainly come across when I've been working with people in the football world, so footballers, and they do like a skin fold test. I think it's to measure like fat or
body
measure,
fat percentage.
Absolutely.
It's the pinch thing.
Yeah. So literally like they
I
pinch your
know what that
skin.
is.
Yeah.
I just didn't know that was what it was called.
It's got a fancy name, skin fold test, but obviously for someone with an eating disorder, that's horrific. Like that is literally like very shaming and very uncomfortable. And I think those small things, which I think are starting to change a little bit.
How do you mean?
So I think it's becoming like people are becoming aware that these have significant impacts on people who do struggle with their mental health, or it might not be the best way to measure those things. Do you know what I mean? So I think there is an awareness that is developing within the sport industry across the board, and mental health is definitely coming, you know, a more prioritised thing. I don't know what it was like 20 years ago, but I know there wasn't, you know, things like Sporting Chance.
What do they do? Because I just noticed that is... Tell us about Sporting Chance.
So Tony Adams set up Sporting Chance, I think it was over like 20 years ago or something like that. And basically, I know he's been quite open about struggling with mental health. And so he started up, I think it was a charity.
Yeah.
And essentially what they do is they work with, you know, the FA, they work with the cricket organisation, and essentially these clubs or organisations can then refer players to the clinic, which then refer out to their registered therapists on their network. And that's where I kind of step in.
What would you say, and we've discussed eating disorders being one aspect, what other things might athletes suffer with and want or need to come to therapy?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, what we tend to forget when we see athletes or celebrities or someone who's on the TV is that actually there is a human being like there. And actually that human being, before or even whilst they were training to be an athlete, has had their own life experiences as well. And, you know, that can vary. It can be things like trauma. It can be addiction issues. It can be family dynamic issues, relationship issues. You know, it varies. And I think there's almost like a divide that we don't always... I think also because obviously it's not going to be public knowledge, that we don't almost kind of appreciate that there's a whole other, like, they also struggle with mental health, just like any of us.
So what would you say is the definition between someone that, you know, might be a pro athlete versus, you know, someone in a normal day-to-day job and some of the experiences they might experience?
I think I didn't appreciate the sacrifice until working with athletes that they have to make. And I don't think...
They don't go out, they don't drink, they don't do the drugs. It's a completely different... I guess out of the limelight, their personal life is restricted in so many ways.
Absolutely. And even, you know, with footballers, you know, these children are training, then they turn into teenagers. And even from, I think the youngest I've worked with is probably someone who had to go and move away from their family, their friends, their school, and go and live with a family. They call them a host family, which basically house those young people or players in general, and they live in a city that they have no one there. They have no support there apart from the clubs and organisations, but and they have to then do all their training there every day. They don't have a normal upbringing like the general public do.
No, and you've just reminded me of, so I raced motorbikes years ago, did it for about 10 years, 11 years-ish. And the amount of youngsters that would be cultivated to be household names and then shipped off to Spain, shipped off to Italy, or vice versa, they'd come from Australia over to the UK, and then they'd have a host family, exactly as you say. So they lose their friends, they lose their social, their childhood gets affected dramatically, and the pressures on racing motorbikes every weekend. They go to school, they race, they clean motorbikes, they tidy up, and it's a great lessons for life, but there's always been an impact to their mental health because they just haven't been brought up the same way as conventional normal people.
No. And I think that's what I didn't appreciate, and I can hold my hands up to that, is that I didn't have that knowledge. I don't think a lot of us do, unless you're in that sort of setting. But these are young people, or just people in general, who are kind of their families and friends may all live in one part of the country, and they're literally put into a house where they don't know anyone. Yeah. And they've got to live there until someone else decides, you're going to move to this club now, and then they move to that club. And that's a lot for a child or a young person or any person to go through, is to be like, right, now you're over here. Do you know what I mean?
And what they're missing out on.
Yeah.
You mentioned a few moments ago about the eating disorders side of things, which I can kind of get an understanding of. When you're in a performance setting, you need to make sure what you eat and your exercise and diet and everything else and nutrition has a big impact. How does that then translate into eating disorders?
Sure. I mean, eating disorders, there's usually some things that we would see that are common with the development of an eating disorder. And there's usually almost like a profile that someone meets. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's not going to be everyone, and there are deviations to that. But, what we have what research has kind of shown is that there are usually several factors, or some of these factors involved. And that comes from sort of enmeshed family dynamics, usually with...
Explain that in more detail.
Yeah, so with enmeshed family dynamics, that kind of means there's a lack of boundary within the family unit, and there isn't very assertive or clear boundaries. So it could be that parents become very over-involved, or they become very enmeshed with their child, and that's usually a factor that we kind of see.
What would be kind of an over-exuberant parent? What would a young person, a child, experience that might give them that kind of anxiety or association to food?
I mean, it's not necessarily about food at this point. It's more around the lack of boundary development, and understanding what clear, healthy boundaries are. So what that could play out is, for example, a mum and a daughter. I'm going to use that as the example here, but mum and daughter. Mum is almost best friends with the daughter, and there is
boundary definition number one failed.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. The roles are very, muddied, and I think it becomes very almost codependent in a way, meaning that maybe the child is helping the mum to navigate her emotions rather than
then becoming responsible for the parent.
Yeah, absolutely. The roles almost reverse. So the child becomes the parent becomes the child. Obviously, that's just one little factor that can add to that. It can cause other issues as well, because, at the end of the day, children need a parent. They need someone who supports them. And I think it can get very muddied very quickly. And then the child almost takes the role of the adult, which means they have to completely dismiss all their feelings, shove them down somewhere to take care of their parent in that respect.
What you're describing sounds like it's fairly common.
Yes, yeah, very common. And not just with eating disorders. It's common, parents want to almost have that really close relationship with their kids, which I think absolutely I'm an advocate for, close, loving, healthy relationships in your family. But there's the lack of boundaries is what makes it an issue.
How might that manifest itself then? Kind of an example of why or what a parent might do which isn't parental?
Sure. Okay. So if, for example, there's disagreements between mum and dad, but there's like very personal information within that, then, whether it's there's an issue in their sex life, for example, telling your child about your sex life and, your parents' sex life, one is probably a bit uncomfortable for them.
I had an anxiety pang when you said that. Then it's thinking, oh,
like,
God, yeah.
The cringe. But do you know what I mean? Like, that's or saying like, oh, I don't know whether I want to be with your dad anymore. Like, I'm thinking about, do you know what I mean? That sort of thing, which for a child who's in the middle of that dynamic, to almost feel responsible for the decision of that or the guidance of that, that's a heavy responsibility to place on a kid.
I guess what you're alluding to is then once the child is in that situation where they feel more responsible for the parent and they've negated a lot of their own feelings and emotions or repressed them, what's the purpose of the eating disorder, I guess?
Sure. So that is kind of the whole function of an eating disorder, is to shut down feelings. It's because feelings aren't being processed, usually because they've learned that there wasn't room for their feelings or it wasn't safe to express feelings. Therefore, if you have this kind of enmeshed family dynamic where the child is taking on the parent's role, they don't have space for their feelings. Therefore, they're not processing feelings. That is a dangerous territory for an eating disorder to develop, amongst other things. But that's part of why, because the whole function of the eating disorder is to help manage those internal feelings, but it doesn't, so that they don't have to feel it because they don't know how to process it.
How does that work then? The eating disorder, we're saying it feels like a fairly blanket term.
Yeah.
I can't help but think there must be so many facets of types of eating disorder.
Absolutely. So the ones I mainly work with are anorexia and bulimia nervosa. Those two are the kind of ones that, I have my expertise in. Obviously, there's loads. There's pica. There is the one where people eat just healthy, but like they go to extremes with it. There's quite a few eating disorders now. Orthorexia, that was the other one. That was
Orthorexia.
Yeah, so that means that they are so focused on eating just a healthy diet, but it goes too far, and it becomes unhealthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's an old saying, it's awful, isn't it? But everything in moderation.
Absolutely.
So,
balance.
So anorexia and bulimia.
Yeah.
If you think about our audience that may not know the difference, how do you describe it?
So anorexia, if you're looking at it from a clinical point, that's where there is episodes or long-term period of starvation, but it can be on and off starvation. Essentially, it's using food to control emotions or environment, feelings, all of that stuff. But anorexia, by definition, is usually they diagnose it once somebody is at a particular weight. However, I do not like
Can't help but think this is a sliding scale.
Oh, yeah. And I think the whole... If you go to a doctor's, and this is a big problem, I think, in a clinical
I'm loving
setting.
this, by the way, because I'm thinking of a talk track right this minute. Go on, keep going. Yeah.
Honestly, so for me, this is where things clinically need to change.
Okay.
So, for example, the clinical definition of someone with anorexia, they have to meet a certain BMI.
Okay.
And that BMI is below 17.5 on the BMI scale.
Really?
If you go into a doctor, and this has happened, I'm someone who has a history of an eating disorder, particularly anorexia. Yeah. This is my experience and the experience of many people who have an eating disorder as well, is that you go to a doctor and you go, I've been starving for months, I've lost 3 stone, do you know what I mean? Like, I've lost a large amount of weight and I can't eat. I know that I've got a problem. They put you on a scale, and because your BMI isn't quite 17.5, they're like, oh, your weight's not low enough to have an eating disorder. So guess what happens?
But they have no context of what your weight was to start with.
No. And also, what happens then when that person walks out the room? They go, oh, basically they hear that as, I'm too heavy to have an eating disorder, I've got to go lose more weight then.
Jesus.
And then you see people who are like really unwell, and they're like, okay, now you can come and get help. But at that point, they've been living with an eating disorder.
Months could have passed.
Exactly. Yeah. And also what I think there isn't the appreciation of is that it's not about necessarily what weight you are. Whilst that is a huge, dangerous, complex issue there in itself, but the rate in which you lose it. So, for example, when I first...
The rate in which you lose it?
Yes. Because what I think a lot of people don't appreciate is that when we lose weight quickly, we're also losing muscle, right?
Right.
One of the largest muscles in our body is our heart. And guess what? When we lose weight quickly and we start losing muscle, we also lose muscle in the heart and we see cardiac problems. For example, my first admission into hospital, I was of a healthy weight. I wasn't of a BMI below 17.5. I think my BMI at that point was like 18.5 or something like that. But I was showing my heart had started to fail, and I had a pulse of 36, which they were like, you're almost clinically like dead or going into cardiac failure at this point. However, I was a healthy weight, but the rate in which I lost the weight was the dangerous part, because it was taking all the weight off, like the muscle was wasting away, which meant my heart was wasting away. And that's what impacted me. And that's why I got hospitalised. But had I'd gone to a doctor and they said, well, your BMI isn't below 17.5. So again, I didn't get the help I needed straight away. And I was could have died in that time. Do you know what I mean? Before I got to that place of being at a BMI that they deemed ill enough to get help.
How did you feel then at that time?
I think I felt desperate, but there's a part when you're in an eating disorder, you also don't want to get better, because meaning like to get better in your head means to put on weight or to have to eat normally again. And that almost becomes the biggest fear that you have.
As in what that might mean?
Yeah, because it is a huge thing. Like if you'd asked me back then to eat a slice of chocolate cake, that would have been the equivalent to telling me like the world was ending now. Like I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to do it. I was like, no, there is no way. Because what people don't appreciate, I think sometimes, is that this voice that develops in your head, it's almost like a separate entity. It's not the person anymore. The person who you know, whether that's your mum, dad, brother, sister, whoever has the eating disorder, has almost been taken over by the eating disorder. And you can see that there's a distinct difference.
So it's not necessarily something like a self-esteem issue. It's something along the lines of being able to be in control of something that you or wasn't normally in control of.
Yeah, so there's definitely an element of self-esteem that plays that's one of the factors that also we look as like there's probably low self-esteem if someone's developing an eating disorder or has one. Yeah. But there's definitely an element for some people, can't say generically, but usually there's an element of being able to control the food intake, because sometimes the rest of your life feels so out of control, or it's a way that you've learned to almost manage life. I was
going to say the same thing then, just manage.
Yeah, and cope.
Yeah.
Like, I think nobody wants to set out and have an eating disorder. It's nobody sets out to go and potentially kill themselves. And I think that the whole idea around the body image stuff, which absolutely plays a part, that your body image becomes very skewed, and, that in itself is an issue, but it's more than just wanting to look good. It's more than just wanting to, lose a couple of pounds or something. This becomes almost like your whole identity.
Yeah.
And that voice becomes your friend. That voice becomes the only thing you can rely on. And it's the consistent thing that's always there and hasn't changed.
Even though it's betraying you.
But in your head, it's not. In your head, it's the thing protecting you from the world, because the world is not a great place sometimes. And actually, that eating disorder has been there through all of it and has kept you safe.
Tell me about your story.
Yeah. So I developed an eating disorder. I would say I had an unhealthy relationship with food. I started about 11 years old. And again, another factor is, a family history of sort of dieting behaviours or being exposed to dieting culture very young, and I was exposed to that. And if you remember back in the 90s, I'm exposing my age here, but if we go back to the 90s and 2000s, if you were reading magazines, on the front of those magazines was, look how much this celebrity has gained weight, look how fat she is, look at her cellulite. It was splashed everywhere. And
shaming on a media level. Yeah.
oh, it was awful. I've looked back at some of those magazines, because you go on like social media, you can find them, and it is absolutely heartbreaking to see that that was the norm of like that shaming of people's bodies was horrific. So that was a part. Obviously, that's a small part of the puzzle. For me, there was a history of trauma. I had trauma in my childhood. I had, you know, with respects to my family, I don't think we always had the best boundaries in place. We had quite enmeshed relationships, quite codependent relationships. And I think, you know, that coupled with being bullied at school, coupled with, you know, all these intense feelings, which I didn't know how to manage. And I had so many emotions, especially if there's trauma involved. You know, there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of fear and anxiety all the time. And so that's when I started leaning into food, first to kind of improve what I thought would make me feel better about myself or make other people like me.
Yeah, because you're describing the slippery slope here, aren't you? So this is how it started.
Absolutely. And I started off just dieting, and I got positive validation for that. Yeah, which obviously people didn't appreciate like where that would go, but that was like, okay, I'm being noticed. I'm being, you know, people think,
here's my reward.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are like praising me and going, wow, look at you now. Like, and I went from being bullied to not being bullied. And actually I was like, well, this is the answer then. Like, this is great. And then it spiraled. And it didn't happen just overnight, but it started with little behaviours, whether that was, you know, religiously counting calories. Like, I had a notebook I carried everywhere, and everything I ate went in this book. And if I'd eaten more than I'd expected, then I had to go and exercise that away. I had to take those calories off.
So you're now going into the compulsive side of...
Yeah. Absolutely. And I was losing weight very quickly. And
define quickly.
So at first it wasn't as quick, but the more I got into the eating disorder, the quicker it came off. So I think I lost 1.5 stone in probably 2 months or something, which, you know, that's quite a lot of weight to lose that quickly, especially as a 12-year-old. And looking back now, I wouldn't say I wasn't a large kid. Do you know what I mean? Like, I probably didn't have 1.5 stone to really lose, but in my head I was like, no. And then I was having complications quite quickly. So I could feel palpitations. I was collapsing. I felt really unwell and became very gaunt very quick. And a lot of people hadn't noticed and didn't appreciate. I don't think they saw it was becoming a problem. And then eventually my mum noticed and was like, you know, what's going on? And she took me to the doctor, and that's where they told me, like, well, you know, she hasn't got a BMI of 17.5, so we can't give her any help for it because, you know, she's not clinically, she doesn't have anorexia. And I was like, at this point, I was eating 150 calories a day.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but apparently didn't have an eating disorder because not quite skinny enough. So, yeah.
You were mentioning, you know, when we go to the doctors and we've got these metrics that need to be considered. What do you think needs to be done differently then?
I think the language, for one, needs to, and the way it's dealt with, in my experience, and I can't say this across the board because I don't know, but my experience of being involved with the doctors was not one of compassion or understanding.
No bedside manner.
No. I was almost kind of shamed into what I was doing, and I knew it was a problem. I knew I no longer had control over controlling my food, and therefore was trying to get help. And for me, I think what needs to change is the understanding it's not about the weight, it's about the behaviour. And obviously that can send people spiraling, to be told, okay, your weight's not low enough to go get help. How are people supposed to stop getting to a point of almost dying if they can't get the help before they're at that point? Do you know what I mean? And I think better preventions need to be in place, or better understanding and education about the language being used. You know, the appreciation for putting that person on a scale and announcing their weight, shaming them. Like that is their biggest fear. And what you've just done is basically put them on a scale and then told them you're not skinny enough. Guess what that does to someone with anorexia? That drives them further into the disorder, and they go, well, I'll go lose more weight then. Like,
describe you at your worst.
So my worst was actually a few years later. So I'd ended up originally, once they realised the heart complications, put into a hospital. And I had several admissions into hospital. I was fitted with a feeding tube, nasal gastric tube, I think it is. And because I refused to eat, full stop. I then went to a psychiatric unit when I was a child. So I was about 12 and a half at this point, 13 years old. And I went to a psychiatric unit, and it scarred me, like genuinely scarred me. The stuff I was exposed to, and also, you know, the whole setting of that environment for me was not a healthy one. It was putting a bunch of people who have anorexia in a room together and eating meals together. There's a competitive nature of anorexia as well.
I've heard this.
And you start learning tricks, and you start learning
to hide the food,
yeah,
how to pretend to eat it.
Oh my! I remember this young girl. I mean, I laugh, and it was the most bizarre thing ever. But it was kind of the norm then. But I remember there was a pork chop when she was trying to eat it, and next thing you know, the pork chop wasn't there, and we were like, wait, where's it gone? And as she was walking out the cafeteria, there was the pork chop in her flip-flop. And we still like kind of joke about it, but...
Where else would you put a pork chop?
Exactly. I was like, well, that's quite genius, really. But it was things like that.
But it's also so sinister.
It is. You're learning how to get sicker. And I came out of that I lived in that psychiatric unit where I wasn't allowed to live at home. I lived there. I did all my school there. I sat my GCSEs in that psychiatric unit. I was exposed to people seriously self-harming themselves to the point of trying to commit suicide. I saw people hanging. I saw people have schizophrenic breaks. And at 13 years old, when you have no previous...
You're not designed to see all that.
No, it was too much. And I came out... I became very institutionalised as well. And I think that was a huge issue in itself. And that's when I got sicker. And so my worst, when I was 19 years old, so I was this height, 5'6", and I weighed just around 4 stone. And I was emaciated, like literally a walking skeleton. And looking back, I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, I literally look dead. Like, I was almost dead. And I was told, you will either die from this, which is the probable outcome of what's going to happen, or you will live with it for the rest of your life. We don't think you're going to recover from this. And that was so damaging, because if you think you're going to live with it for the rest of your life, then you're like, why am I trying to get better then? And I can say for the record, despite what those doctors told me, despite what those psychiatrists told me back then, I don't live with an eating disorder today. I don't have any parts of an eating disorder in my life. I have a very healthy and normal attitude towards my body and also my food.
What changed then?
What changed for me is feeling like I'd hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
And obviously you can't go much lower.
Sounds like you bumped into yourself.
I did, yeah. I bumped into the reality of what I thought was going to help didn't. And I think that kind of made me go, whoa, look, Lauren, you've taken it to the point of death and you're still not happy. And that's what you were promised with this eating disorder. That's what the eating disorder says. It's like, look, this is going to make you happier. This is going to make you feel more accepted and part of everything, and it didn't do those things.
I was just thinking about your connection with the anorexia and your story. And I mentioned it earlier on when we talked about sort of the two, I guess, the most common anorexia and bulimia. The bulimia is more eating and then bringing it back up. Am I right?
Yeah, there's usually episodes of binging and purging, and what I mean by that is eating lots of food very quickly, and then purging it, whether that is through vomiting or laxative use. It's basically getting rid of the food that you've eaten, and it's a cycle of behaviour that kind of keeps going around like that. There's a pattern to it.
What's the health implications of that?
So obviously there's erosion of the teeth if they're purging through vomiting.
Because of the stomach acids?
Yeah, you've got a lot of dental issues as a result of it. You also can weaken the esophagus, and that can become very scarred and very, it doesn't work quite properly. So people get bad acid reflux and things like that, and they aren't able to keep their food down, because the body's so used to bringing it back up again. It can also throw off your electrolytes, which obviously is really dangerous, and can result in death. It's just as serious as any other eating disorder.
Those two main ones. Am I right in thinking anorexia, bulimia are the most common, or?
I think so. I think usually when people say eating disorders, they're usually referring to those two. However, there are others, like pica, which I believe is eating non-food items. So like cotton wool and things like that.
Paper, I've heard.
Yeah, paper. Could be anything really. And then you also have orthorexia. I think that one is probably more common than we understand, because of the lack of awareness around it, but also where do you then go, it's an eating disorder and not just someone trying to eat healthy? Do you know what I mean? I think it's more difficult.
So that's the one where they might eat only vegetables, but missing out other major food groups.
Absolutely. And their focus is just on healthy eating, but it becomes so rigid. So it has elements of the anorexia, but it's less about starvation and calories, but more about just nutrition and getting the right food in.
That feels almost like a hunt for identity.
Yeah. I think people, with eating disorders, there isn't a strong sense of self and self-esteem in that. And I think actually having almost those rituals that come with an eating disorder become part of them in a way, and it becomes a part of what they do and who they are. And, for a lot of people I know, especially with anorexia, it becomes a part of their identity. That is their identity. And also it's, going back to anorexia specifically, but, these people, people who are struggling with it, it might be the first time that they've received care or love or felt important.
Oh, they're getting rewarded for it.
Yeah. But what they're actually starving for is love. They're starving for connection, healthy connection. And actually the horrible part of it is the eating disorder almost missells them this promise that you're going to feel so loved and have all this connection when you lose all this weight. And the opposite happens, because the more that they go into the disorder, the more they shut down, the more they become closed off to connection, and they are literally starving for connection.
Talking about connection, how do you think social media is impacting these kind of eating disorders?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it does play a part, because there's a lot of comparison. I work with teenage girls, for example, and, there's a lot of self-esteem issues or body image issues, because what they're seeing on this influencer's page or whatever is not the reality for them, or there isn't, that person might have taken 20 shots on a camera for that perfect angle.
There was actually a photo shoot.
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't on their phone.
Yeah, and they were photoshopped a bit and a bit edited here, and like this was changed or whatever. But the lighting was done perfectly, so you can't see any like stretch marks or cellulite or whatever. But I think it distorts the reality of what a healthy body looks like. I am more encouraged to see that there are positive body influencers out there who are like just accepting of themselves. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that is really helpful. But I think the focus on our bodies having to be almost this thing that we have to either accept or not accept is an issue in itself. Like, we've lost the understanding of just like our bodies are our vehicle that gets us around, and it does so much for us. And I think a lot of us, even if we don't have bad relationships with the way that we eat, we might have negative relationships to our body in general. And what I mean by that is like when we're sick, when we got the cold, for example, and we're like, oh God, I feel so rubbish, and you're just trying to push through it. And actually it's like, oh, why can't I get over this illness? Like, come on, like I need more energy. Then we try and push through it. Our body is literally doing everything to fight off an infection or a virus, and we're there like adding more pressure to it. Yeah, mistreating it, and like almost being like, why isn't it working good enough? It is working good enough. It's actually doing so much to keep you alive even in this moment.
The irony is, and this is my hunch, and I don't know if you agree, but if we look after our mental health first, everything else follows after.
Absolutely.
I do think that going to the gym, eating well, all complement everything. But if you don't feel good about who you are, then you're coming at it from the wrong angle.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right on that. You can go to the gym as many times as you like.
You might be chasing the adrenaline,
Yeah.
but you're not chasing comfort, acceptance, positive self-regard, self-esteem.
I ask people if they go, I think going to the gym is going to make me feel happier. Okay, what do you hope to get at the end of keep going to the gym all the time? Like, what is the end result for you? What do you want out of it? And if they go, well, I want to lose a few pounds, or I want to look this, and I go, okay, for who? For you or for anyone else? And then they're like, okay, well, if it's for them, great, or whatever, or if it's for someone else, great. But what do you want from that person or from yourself then at the end of that? What's the result? What are you trying to get?
What would be the evidence that you've succeeded?
Yeah.
And if it's external,
Sure.
You've highlighted the problem, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. But also if it's, that it comes down to like, well, I want to feel better about myself. Okay, why don't you feel better about yourself now then? Like, what's going on? What is it that you think changing the way your body is in some way is going to help change those emotions or that relationship to yourself? And I think that is a huge issue, is that we almost try and rely on external factors and things that we can tangibly see or tangibly change, rather than actually looking really inwards and going like, oh, why don't I accept myself right now? Again, I'm not here to say that going to the gym or working and trying to eat healthily like is a bit negative thing. I can understand if you just want to feel more healthy and you want to be able to go on a run or whatever, that's great.
And not die.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's an added bonus. So
I got home.
Yeah, exactly.
And not in an ambulance.
I'm not like literally trying to like gasp for air. Like I get that. That's great. However, if you're doing it to change or try and fit in, or you're trying to change how you feel, it's not going to end up doing that in the long term. It might do superficially, but I think there's something deeper there where it's about uncomfortability with self.
It just occurred to me as you were talking then, is that in my mind, I was going down the talk track of thinking that this is associated to predominantly girls, but it can't be.
No.
What does the male demographic of eating disorders look like?
I mean, it's obviously there is a higher percentage. If we're looking at statistics, it presents higher with girls, but it's not limited to girls. And there is definitely there are loads of men out there struggling with eating disorders for the very same reasons. And I think there's usually, with anorexia, I think the research, the statistics vary quite hugely on it, but there's usually a 20 to 50% chance, especially in anorexia, that there was a level of abuse or trauma that's happened. Bulimia, we see higher percentage of people with histories of sexual abuse. And again, that...
Purging the body.
Yeah, and also they enter... So the binging and purging, like, they almost go into a trance-like state, which is a dissociative state.
Right.
Which in itself, so disassociation is basically like escape from reality. It's almost kind of going like outside of yourself in a way and just not being there. And it's almost, you know, some of that process is about trying to come to terms with the trauma or trying to enter that dissociative state, which is safe. It's about comfort. It's about feeling for that brief moment, like you would do a drug, that I've escaped reality, I've escaped my feelings, like nothing else matters. It's just about eating the food. And then the shame hits. And then that's when the purging happens. Or the guilt comes in. And then that's when the purging happens.
Just sounds like a rabbit hole of so many aspects to this.
Absolutely.
What would you say has got you excited about writing your book?
Yeah.
And what's it about specifically?
So the book that I'm in the development of is, so I find, especially for anyone that's experienced abandonment in childhood or difficulties in childhood, there's often sometimes issue, and again, it can apply to anyone, but with low self-esteem comes a low relationship to self or a distorted relationship to self. And, you know, there's attachment issues there as well from childhood. Then, especially if there's been abandonment in that person's life, there's a fear of abandonment that drives a lot of people, you know, for a lot of different reasons and in a lot of different ways. And what hopefully I'm developing is a book which helps to reconnect people back with themselves in a very simple, childlike way. I believe in, and I use like inner child work with clients, and that's something I've done personally for myself as well. And it has transformed my relationship with myself. I can say single-handedly, some of those exercises, which I still do today, have changed how I show up for myself. And I think, importantly, for people who have experienced abandonment in childhood or any point in their life, but have that low relationship to self or they have a very disconnected relationship to self, understanding that there is that little girl or little boy who is still in there, and remembering that, because actually that changes the way that we talk to ourselves then. Because if I say to you, okay, Elliot, like, I want you to picture that little boy you were at 6 years old, okay, and find a picture for me that where he looks so sweet and so innocent. And when you look at that picture, tell me some of the feelings that might have been going on for him at that time in his life. And now I want you to talk to that boy, that little boy in that picture.
In the appropriate setting.
Yeah, but also talk to him in the way that you talk to yourself now. So if you tell yourself, you know, some of those narratives, I'm a failure, I'm fat, you're ugly, you're stupid, you're dumb, this is why no one likes you, all of that. Now tell it to that little boy or that little girl. And how do you think that makes them feel? Because that's who's listening. When you're talking to yourself and it's in your head and it's going, I'm stupid, I'm rubbish, you're talking to that child because it's still there. That state is still there. How do you think that's impacting that child? And if you wouldn't say it to that child, why the hell are you saying it to yourself?
That's good. It's interesting. We did a show with James Penny a little while back, and he was talking about the screensaver for his phone is a picture of him when he was a small boy. So he always gets reminded that he's still there and should treat him accordingly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that.
We almost reparent ourselves, and I think, you know...
Still am.
Yeah, exactly. I've still got some work to do, that's definitely
No change.
Sure. Yeah. But, like, I do believe in, you know, that's kind of where the book comes in, is to help people, remind people of that, to show them that there is that little child that still remains in there, and that we have to show up in a loving way. But also, in terms of that abandonment stuff I was saying about, the biggest issue is that we abandon ourselves. someone might have abandoned us at 7 years old, say. However, when we talk to ourselves in that way, that is so demeaning and so derogatory.
Yeah.
We abandon ourselves every time, or we abandon ourselves when we don't speak up for what's right for us, when we don't put a boundary in. We abandon ourselves when we don't say, I don't like the way you said that because it's really hurt my feelings. And we sit there and people please and go, yeah, no, that was great. We abandon ourselves on a daily basis, but it's actually about understanding that the repercussions of that is a complete disconnect with self.
Final question. I'm thinking about parents and when young people might start to experience or exhibit some of the telltale signs of an eating disorder. Can you name 3, 4, 5 that their child might be struggling?
I think obviously hearing if your child is heavily critiquing the way that they look, or, you know, saying, I feel fat, or commenting on their body image a lot, I think that is usually a sign that there's an issue with their relationship with their self, with a body image issue. There's obviously, if we're looking at anorexia, for example, then the restriction or the control around food, cutting out food groups is quite a big thing, obviously, but not limited to. What if you notice weight loss? That's going to be a telltale sign. But also the issue is with these disorders is that they are quite masked. They are quite hidden.
They sound manipulative in some respects.
They are. And I think people become very, like, people who are in that person's life, with the person with the eating disorder, they can also almost kind of think that that's that person coming forward, but it's not. It's the illness. And the illness makes them act and behave and say things that are not in their character. And it can really take over a person. But I think that's the thing with parents. I guess if you're looking out for telltale signs, you know, I think it's about, rather than telltale signs, looking at areas where they can feel the hunger, like see what they're hungry for, figuratively speaking there, but you know, looking at whether they have good friend networks, social networks, support networks, good boundaries, processing feelings. Those are the things I think, you know, are things that we all need to be aware of, especially when working with children, looking at what, like, having children, is making sure that those fundamental needs of love, security, safety, and feeling heard and feeling validated
get the building blocks right.
Absolutely. But yeah, I think, as you say, there are telltale signs, and I guess, you know, bulimia-wise, looking at, you know, if there's large amounts of food that are suddenly gone, or, you know, like with purging, if there's vomiting happening, they tend to have quite swollen cheeks as a result. They almost like hamster cheeks because of the acid coming up. It's aggravating all the lining of the mouth. So things like that. But, you know, I think early intervention is so important as well. That's
why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Seems pertinent.
Yeah. I guess maybe just listening for what's going on for them. And helping, like also being aware of, you know, as a parent, being aware of what your relationship with your body's like, because how you treat yourself, how you speak to yourself is being listened to.
Yeah. That's why I say to a couple of clients, and they say, I tell my children to do this and do that, and they never do it.
Yeah.
So how are you acting? And they're acting completely differently. What you do is what they learn.
Yeah.
Lauren.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed this and really appreciate it. Hopefully you'll come back again.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.